Everyone for hopping on. This is sort of the forgotten sister of our offer to purchase. Some people use it every time they write an offer. Some people don't. They figure, well, it's talking about well water and all that, so I don't need that. And I'm doing a condo and I don't need that. A word of advice, I think, and the WRA agrees with me, that it really should be attached to every offer to purchase, whether it's a condo, whether it's even something as remote as vacant land, definitely residential. This addendum A that we're going to talk about first is developed by lawyers, of course, and added to by lawyers. Every time there was another lawsuit, they put another phrase in there. But it really is a consumer protection form. And that's the way we have to look at it. It protects the buyer over the seller as far as clarity on all of the things that could pop up. So a lot of these things may be not applicable, NA, and you would put the NA in that box. But there are things that do protect the buyer that don't even have an option on it, addendum A. It's just stated, and both buyer and seller initial addendum A when it's received, when it's sent and received. So what I'm going to do is just go over the addendum A. I'm not going to read every line, but I'm going to concentrate on the topics of every one. I encourage you to read every line every once in a while, either to yourself or to the buyer, but it's a good idea to know how to encapsulate to the buyer what each section means and what it means to the buyer, how it does protect them. So if you're ready, I'm ready. And if you have any questions as we're going along, just unmute yourself and holler or put in a chat that I'll get to in a while. So we're going to start on the addendum A to offer to purchase. It's must have a date. It must have the name of the buyer, and it must have the address of the property. In that identification, it becomes unique to the property that you're writing on. Inclusion of optional provisions. And they're telling you the provisions are preceded by an open box, are part of this addendum if marked with an X. They are not part if marked NA or left blank except for provided. So as I said, good advice, best practice, mark an X if you want it, mark an NA if you don't want it. For optional provisions in this offer and any addenda which require a box to be checked, which has not been marked NA or stricken in their entirety, if any blank within the part of that optional provision has been filled in by handwriting or typing, then it shall be as if the appropriate box was also checked, that including said optional provision. It means if you're using a templated addendum A and it has some fill-ins on some of these blank lines, but it's not applicable to your offer, by leaving it blank, but having some of these lines filled in from a templated or accidentally put in, you are incorporating that provision in your offer. So keep it strict, and this warning, because it's in bold, is telling you either use NA or X for the boxes if you want them part of the offer to purchase. The first one, seller contribution, it's closing cost credits. You can put in the actual amount if left blank to assist the buyer in purchasing the property. Any funds not applied as a loan cost credit or prepayable shall be credited back to the seller at closing. I think that's a sentence a lot of people ignore. It's important. This is exclusive of any loan fees indicated on the offer. Always check with the lender on the amount of closing cost credits you are able to use. Some people think that's just an open amount. It's not. It is capped by the amount of the loan. So make sure the lender tells you how much you can ask for a closing cost credit. Again, if there's a home warranty program that your buyer has wanted a home warranty program, you make sure you check this box, put in the cost of the home warranty. If it's our home warranty, we know what the cost is, or you can have the warranty plan ordered by the listing company. The seller is offering a home warranty. And in that case, you strike selling. So you can either have Keller Williams warranty program, or you can use the seller's home warranty program. And it says, note, buyer has been informed of the availability of a limited home warranty plan. That means you just can't go in and demand one necessarily, but you want to see if it's available. The association fee. Now, this would be an NA, but if there's no association, but definitely an X if there is, and you put how much, and is it per month or per year or per quarter? Next section, inspections, tests, appraisals, and opinions. This is very important and even finished with a caution, but it's saying they may furnish a list of independent inspectors, testers to the party. No representation has been made to the competency of the inspector's tests. The party designated as responsible for obtaining an inspection test shall be solely responsible for determining the qualifications of the inspector. In the event any inspection test on behalf of the parties by a firm or in the transaction, the parties agree to hold the firm harmless for any damages or liability resulting from the inspection or test, other than that caused by the firm's negligence or intentional wrongdoing. Buyer may receive copies of certain inspections, this is important, test, appraisal, and other reports prepared for other persons. Buyer should carefully review these reports to determine the age of the report, the purpose for what they were prepared, and the standards of practice followed by the individual preparing the report. It is recommended that the buyer have the property inspected by a professional inspector. Now, I read every line in that because it is incredibly important. And it's one of those things that we sort of go through the addendum A and with a blah, blah, blah. But it is something you should concentrate on. You understand it and communicate that understanding to your buyer. And therefore, caution. The firm and its agents, here in the firm, recommends buyer have the property tested and inspected for all conditions that buyer considers. And they're talking about inspection and testing. They are two separate things in the offer to purchase, and they are making sure that they recommend that they have them done. I know in this competitive market, a lot of agents, in fact, I think it's the majority of buyers right now are skipping inspections to be chosen, and sometimes that is a mistake. This is the important part where you mark an X if you want any additional testing beyond the inspection. It has to be independent third party documenting the results of the following tests. Conducted pursuant to applicable government protocols and standards. Here it says insert tests to be performed. I have railed on this for years and years and years. Don't say any test recommended by the inspector. You actually should insert the actual tests that you want to be performed. And the comeback is, oh, well, how do I know what tests we need to have performed? This is something where your buyer can say, I'm allergic to mold. I don't want a house with, radon, whatever. But there are only a few tests actually that they can do, asbestos and mold and other substances or conditions which may affect the health of occupants or the value of the structure. put in the individual tests. So it's to be done within how many days? 15 if left blank of acceptance at buyer's or seller's expense. It should be buyers, default to buyers. And the testing shall be performed by an independent, qualified independent third party. Seller shall not have the right to cure. I think it's important to give the seller the right to cure on any testing contingency. Some of the cures are very easy, simple, like with radon, but give the seller the option. And now this is something where it's not in the offer, but it's certainly important to a buyer if they are buying property on well. So here are boxes for well water testing and well system testing. The difference between the two is the well water, they take a sample of the water and make sure that it doesn't have any following substances, bacteria, coliform, E. coli, nitrate, arsenic, and if there are any other substances that your buyer does not want, you add those on this line. If desired, insert other substances that may affect the drinking water, and they're giving you examples: lead, pesticides, nitrite, copper, radium, etc. And then you put down who's responsible for obtaining the report, including all costs, agrees to promptly provide copies of the report to the other party. All water samples used for testing shall be taken by a licensed plumber or other qualified third party. Seller shall not have the right to cure, and in this case, again, I would give the seller the right to cure. If there's just something in the water like bacteria, it's a very simple cure of adding chlorine to the well. Now, the well system inspection contingency is a little more active. This is for a private well, not a community well. And the offer is contingent upon the buyer receiving no later than blank days prior to closing. That's important. That's different than the other contingencies. They want a fresh water, a fresh well system test. They don't want something that was done like 5 years ago or something. So it has to be done within 60 days prior to the date set for closing from a licensed pump installer. And what this inspection is they're checking the effectiveness of the pump. They want to see if the pump is on its last legs or that it's pumping according to the rate that it should be pumping. And that's basically how you inspect a well system. If you just select the well system, down here it says if the well is inspected, well water testing contingency is automatically selected and included in this offer. So again, I would give the seller right to cure on well system inspection contingency. Some of the cures are very reasonable. Abandoned wells. There's some of abandoned wells in some of our communities. Bayside is one of them. But you want to make sure that it is abandoned correctly and has been closed in compliance with the applicable codes. Also in Bayside, and there's some other communities around the Milwaukee area that have shared wells, where there's one well servicing 2 or 4 properties usually. And if drinking water is taken from the shared well, the seller at seller's expense provide buyer with a copy of the shared well agreement, which provides standards for operation, maintenance, use of the shared well for residential purposes. No later, again, 15 days prior to closing. They want newer reports, newer documents. Unless this sentence is stricken, the agreement shall provide for the pro rata cost sharing of all the parcels included in the agreement. So how much does each homeowner have to pay to maintain this shared well agreement? And if this agreement has not been recorded, it shall be provided in recordable form with recording fees. This is very important for you as the lister. If there is a shared well agreement, you have to have it recorded. If it's on a private sanitary system, and that's when you get out into Ozaukee County, Washington County, there are private sanitary systems, not subdivision. Those can be by territories, like in Mequon, there's some broad areas that are serviced by their own sanitary system. But they're talking here about a private sanitary system where a home has a septic system or a mound system or a pump system. And so if you check this, the property is served by a private sanitary system. This offer is contingent upon buyer receiving no later than, and again, it's so many days prior to closing, 15 if left blank, a written report dated no earlier than blank days prior to the date set for closing, 60 if left blank, from a county code administrator, licensed master plumber, licensed master, dated no earlier than blank days prior to the date set for closing, 60 if left blank. From a county, licensed master plumber, restricted service, licensed plumber, designer, registered engineer, certified POUTS inspector, certified septic operator, certified soils tester, which indicates that the POUTS system conforms to the code in effect when the system was installed and not disapproved for current use. So buyer and seller shall be responsible for obtaining the port. Seller is the default, and including all costs other than pumping costs. The POUTS to be pumped at time of inspection, the seller at seller's expense, regardless of the strike on line 61. And then seller shall be given the right to cure. So they drop in a caution: different professionals may need to inspect different system components. Buyer is aware that POUTS are regulated by state and county agencies. Additional inspection, testing, and ongoing maintenance may be required upon transfer of the property. So obviously you can tell this is a big deal. Historically, a lot of these properties, private properties, were serviced by a septic system. Big hole was dug in the ground, some base put in the bottom of the hole, chemicals added to the hole, and the septic from the house goes into this thing. The bacteria and all of that eat at it, dissolve it into this hole. And then occasionally the septic has to be cleaned out or looked at. The bad news is that a lot of these septic systems are now no longer permitted. The EPA has just said, nope, it's not good enough. The dirt doesn't filter it enough, and you have to go to a more efficient system. Efficient being not necessarily a good word. So that means either a mound system or a pump system, and those have their benefits and their drawbacks. But that's why this section on private sanitary system is very important if you're looking at rural properties or properties out around the lakes. So right to cure. Now they give you the same right to cure options that are in the offer to purchase in this section, but it's important that you read it, that knowing that curing the defects are in a good and workmanlike way, you may want to alter that and say done by a licensed plumber or inspector or whatever investigator you're using. But make sure that you read this area knowing exactly what right to cure means in the septic system. Under the sanitary district sewer construction, buyers informed that the property may be located with an established sanitary district. Buyer may be subject to taxes, special assessments, and other charges for sewer planning or construction, user fees, or related costs. Buyer is encouraged to contact officials of the sanitary district to inquire about these costs. If you are a buyer's agent This is incredibly important. This is one of the services of above and beyond that you should be performing for your buyer. So you and your buyer encouraged, the onus falls on the buyer, but you could help the buyer by contacting the officials of the sanitary district to find out what these extra costs may be for district sewer construction. So that happened a lot in Mequon, happens in Bayside, the areas that I'm familiar with, but I know it also happens a lot in Brookfield and the west side subdivisions. So now we get to financing. And when the financing commitment contingency in the offer includes the following terms. So make sure that this is added on to that financing commitment contingency. Remember, that's a new phrase. It used to be financing contingency. Now it's the financing commitment, that you get a commitment to finance. And that's the contingency that must be given. So within 7 days of acceptance, the buyer shall obtain written confirmation from a financial institution that the buyer has already applied for financing. Very important, very ignored, and make sure that you read this section carefully to your buyer. Seller may, no earlier than 7 days after acceptance, deliver a written request for written confirmation of application. Buyer shall deliver written confirmation of application no later than 5 days after seller's delivery of the written request. So timing is of the essence, which is in your offer to purchase. And delaying applying for a loan is not part of the agreement. And it states it here in Addendum A, as I said, consumer protection. Buyer agrees to pay any and all costs of obtaining financing, including the cost of closing in the mortgage transaction. Flood insurance, if required, may be in addition to the stated monthly payment. So make sure that you help your buyer find out all of the extra costs that could be in getting financing and work with the buyer's lender. A loan commitment is defined as a commitment from a financial authorized to do business in the state of Wisconsin. It does not include a condition requiring the sale of property unless the offer is contingent on the close of the property. So you can't, and this is a hidden fact, you can't ignore a home sale contingency in your offer. But your lender has said, in order to get this loan, you need the proceeds from the sale of your house. So they're telling you that you've got to write in a contingency on the closing of the property if it's required in the sale from the lender. Buyer acknowledges the buyer's obligation to have the total purchase price, including the mortgage loan proceeds, available at the time of closing. Buyer is advised to determine when the buyer's loan obligation to have the total purchase included in the mortgage loan at the time of closing. I'm sorry, I reread that. Buyer is advised to determine when the buyer's loan proceeds will be funded to ensure that the funds will be available on the time of closing. Remember, the lender is not obligated to follow the terms of your offer. You're sort of working together, hoping that the lender can perform by the dates and terms of your offer, but it doesn't mean they're obligated to do so. So make sure that you are in touch with the lender and that your buyer is in touch with the lender. Closing company require parties to wire funds necessary for the completion of the transaction. The parties acknowledge this requirement may result in additional costs to be paid by the buyer unless otherwise agreed in writing. Now, if you waive the financing commitment contingency, and a lot of people are doing that for competition, and you're making this a cash offer, and within 7 days of delivery of the notice of the waiver of the financing commitment contingency, buyer delivers a written verification from a financial institution or third party in control of buyer's funds that buyer has at the time of verification sufficient funds to close this transaction at the time of verification, which are not contingent on the sale of the buyer's property. Seller agrees to waive the seller's rights under the financing commitment contingency. Delivery of the loan commitment is considered written verification of sufficient funds to close if the loan commitment is not contingent on the sale of the buyer's property, and buyer provides written verification confirming sufficient funds for the amount which the sale price exceeds the amount of the loan commitment. What they're saying is you have to back up your cash offer with proof that you have the proof of funds. It's the proof of funds can be viable if the seller accepts them. If it's not cash sitting in your buyer's checking account or savings account, but it has to be movable. It has to be at the time of verification. And if it's anything other than that, say a bonus or proceeds coming in before closing and things like that, that is up to the seller to decide whether they're going to accept that as proof of funds. If the seller doesn't accept that, the buyer cannot use a cash offer unless he comes up with a verified proof of funds. If this offer is contingent upon buyer obtaining FHA, USDA, or VA loan, parties agree to execute an amendment to the contract which shall give the buyer right to terminate the offer to purchase if the property fails to appraise for the purchase price. Seller also agrees to pay lender at the time of closing a tax service fee not to exceed $100. For the VA mortgage, the seller, buyer or seller, and it's default to the seller, agrees to pay the entire funding fee not to exceed 0% of the mortgage amount. VA mortgages include a termite inspection, even though Wisconsin really doesn't have a lot of termite. We have other things, but not termite. But the VA mortgage is going to require it anyway. The other thing to read, and sometimes these are ignored because there's no box, nothing to fill in, but they're very important. And that, again, is why this is a consumer protection. Your consumer, your buyer, and if you're the buyer's agent, must be comforted by the conditions provisions in this Addendum A. So make sure that you read about the area conditions, whether there's construction going on, sewer construction. Buyer acknowledges that if material to the buyer's decision to purchase the property has reviewed the media and may increase, excuse me, I keep skipping lines. Buyer acknowledges that if the material to the buyer's decision to purchase, the buyer has reviewed the seller and the firm's representations regarding known conditions and has become familiar with the area surrounding the property. So you don't want a buyer getting into a house and say, I didn't know they were going to be tearing this all up, and I didn't know this was going to be assessed and all of this. This is making sure that the buyer does their homework and you as the buyer's agent helps them with that homework. Property conditions, parties are aware that news media and other public information sources indicate that asbestos, mold, lead-based paint, lead in the drinking water, radium, radon gas, all these other substances and chemicals within the soil or water supplies can cause serious health. And unless otherwise disclosed in writing, seller represents to the best of seller's knowledge the property does not contain any of these substances. A number of communities report that elevated levels of radium may be present in the water supply. Buyer agrees to obtain third-party inspectors and tests to determine if the property. So again, as the buyer's agent and as the listing agent, you as agents are responsible to research the property conditions, research the area, make sure that you are aware of this so that you can instruct your seller and the buyer's agent can instruct their buyer on how to make these inquiries in and finding information that may actually prevent them from wanting to buy this property. So the more they know, the more the seller discloses, the less we'll see of lawyers. Any questions regarding this? Okay. I'm going to skip it all because I'm encouraging you to read it and I don't want to read it to you. Underground storage tanks, basement fuel oil. This is another situation we'll find in the east side, lower east side, city, south side, where there still may be underground storage tanks and fuel oil tanks. So if the seller has notice or knowledge of any tank in the basement or buried in the ground, if one is discovered prior to closing, seller shall, prior to closing, deliver to buyer written confirmation that the tank related components and procedures relating to upgrading are in full compliance with all federal, state, and local regulations. Removal of most residential basement fuel oil tanks is not required under state law. So if it's in the basement, it's not required to get it out, but if it's buried, it may be, and it may have leaked, which has contaminated the soil around it. So do your research, listing agent, make sure the research, and if you are aware of it, you must disclose it. Zoning and building restrictions, comprehensive plans, non-conforming property, building permits. This again is homework for the buyer's agent and homework for the listing agent. Make sure that you
Dennis and Maggie, did Joan freeze for you guys too?
pardon me?
Oh, you froze on my end, so I'm okay.
Okay.
We're back in action.
Good. But in bold, it says buyer assumes all responsibility and a liability to research, verify, and confirm. So the buyer can't say, well, the agent didn't tell me, or nobody told me this. It says in bold, buyer assumes all responsibility. So we had a buyer take an agent to ethics panel and saying that the buyer's agent didn't perform. But this line was read, actually. Yeah. I must have been kicked out too. It says my internet connection is not stable. So, any questions from anybody up to this point? Is this too much? Should I summarize more? Read less? Okay. I'll go back to this. Steph, do you have any ideas what, whether I'm blipping in or out? I can't tell whether I'm on or not.
It's just been the 2 times. So
Okay.
yeah, hopefully we're good now.
Okay. Any suggestions from anybody else? Please pipe in for questions.
It's a lot. to be
Yeah,
talking
a lot.
about.
But, and that's the encouragement that we want to do. And this is why we are reviewing Addendum A especially. Addendum S is more cut and dried, and I'll get to it if we have time. But to me, the knowledge of all of the sections of Addendum A are critically important. And if you're not including it in the offer, you are actually robbing the buyer of a lot of protection, as you can see. A lot of ideas that an agent may not think about, but the Addendum A is there to remind the agent and to remind the buyer what is important to them and give them the responsibility. They just can't sit back and complain that nobody told them this or nobody said that. So again, survey, unless it's provided, it's not required. If they're buying in a subdivision plat is considered to be equivalent to a survey. But in regular established home properties, residential home properties, a survey is not required unless the buyer wants one. Floodplains and wetlands, we can check into the municipality. There are maps and floodplain maps that you can look through to see if the property that you're on or considering buying is in or without or not within a floodplain or a wetland. It will affect the cost of buyer's flood insurance if it is, and that can be very expensive. Insurance provisions. So they're talking about building materials, insurability, things that the insurance will not cover anymore. And they're talking about knob and tube wiring or aluminum wiring. Your insurance company is basically just going to deny covering it. You might be able to find an insurance company that will cover it, but it's best to have that updated. If the property is using fuses or is less than 100 amps, it should be upgraded to no less than 100 amp circuit breaker. All knob and tube wiring, and we do have that in the Lower East Side. Some places, these homes were built around the turn of the last century, 1900s. Most of those older homes were wired by knob and tube, and it's an extreme fire hazard. Flood insurance, and again, I talked about that. If the property is, according to the maps, in the flood zone, there is possibility of flood insurance. Buyer is aware that premiums paid for flood insurance on this property may not be an accurate indication of premiums charged after the purchase of this property. So switching to another insurance company or getting newer information or something may change the actual cost of flood insurance. If this is a rental property, in the city of Milwaukee, they require a registration form and a fee of residential rental properties within 15 days of closing. Lead water service lines ordinances. We've been having some problems with this. There are a lot of laterals and water service lines in the city of Milwaukee that are lead pipes and are delivering our water through lead. So taking that kind of information, looking into it as much as possible, seeing what the property you're considering buying has, this is a heads up for you as a buyer. City letters, no later than closing, seller shall provide buyer with written verification of paid real property taxes, contemplated and or outstanding special assessments. This is a job of the title company, and they will make sure that the seller provides the buyer with that information. Addendum provisions, and they're saying advise this addendum contains provisions that may not be appropriate in all transactions. No representation is made that the provisions are appropriate, adequate, or legally sufficient. Buyer and seller are encouraged to consult their own legal counsel regarding the provisions of this offer. So if your buyer or you are not sure whether this is pertinent to the property your buyer is buying, check with legal counsel. There's a place for you to attach any addendums like the lead-based paint. So you put a check mark there and then the label of that is S. Or if there's talking about delayed occupancy, you put a check mark there and the label is 0. Oh, you can add additional addendums. They've got blanks for those. If you want to write an additional contingency, I love this. It's set up just to read a correct contingency. It's contingent upon whatever the terms are, gives the date on or before that, and if in the event that, say, the contingency cannot be met, this is what should happen. And any place for additional provisions, and then here to identify the buyer's agent and identify the seller's agent. And then, as I said, it's initialed by both parties. Whether the offer is being accepted or not, the seller must initial the receipt of this addendum A. So, did I miss anything? Do you feel more familiar with it? Our recommendation is to use it, whether there's a lot of applicable provisions or not. Oh, great point, Dennis. Yes, the GMAR Addendum A is the one that we recommend that you use. So up in the upper right-hand corner of the first page, it should say GMAR Addendum A. There's also the WRA version of the Addendum A, which we do not recommend using because it's more for areas in the state of Wisconsin, lakes, property, farmlands, things like that, that really aren't as applicable to residential and condominium terms. So that's why we recommend the Addendum A. Now, if you're writing in other parts of the state, you're most likely going to get a WRA Addendum A. And again, just look at both of them for what's appropriate. But for the most part, our properties that we deal with, we use the GMAR Addendum A. So you can search for that. I think the title starts with the Greater Milwaukee Association of Realtors Addendum A. So if you're searching for it, start looking for Greater Milwaukee Association of Realtors. So any other questions at all on the Addendum A? Good.
I'm looking at the WRA's version. It's just like not as robust. And, as Joan had commented right in the beginning, attorneys are we're adding on to our GMAR Addendum A all of the time as things came up. So there's like a testing contingency in here, but like you have to specifically say what you want. So it's not even just like the well water is not in here, well inspection is not in here. Yeah.
The GMAR one, again, is important because it does separate the testing from the inspection. So the inspections of the property and the radon testing is in the offer to purchase. And then all other testing is in the Addendum A. So making sure that if you want to include asbestos or mold or tests like that, you have to use the Addendum A to ask for those contingencies. And the offer to purchase and the Addendum A make it very clear that the two are very separate. They do not enwrap one another. Okay, I'm going to go on to the Addendum S.
Yeah, Addendum S.
Okay, and this won't take as long. It's basically, if the property is 1978 or older, you must use the addendum S. You must use the lead paint disclosure and acknowledgements. The heaviness that is not realized with this addendum S is that any litigation coming from not providing it for a property 1978 or earlier, or miswriting, saying that you don't have any disclosures, or you don't have any knowledge, actual knowledge, and you do. It's huge, as they call it, business destroying fines and litigation. So I think when it was first introduced to us as agents, they purposely scared the pants off of us on how to use the addendum S, how to fill it out, making sure that the seller understood what he was saying and that he was talking about actual knowledge. It's sort of dissipated over the years, where I think people just pull it out and very quickly fill it out and not have the awareness of how important this addendum S is. Because any, as I say, misrepresentation on this can be extremely damaging. So what it is, because houses built before and on 1978 used a lot of lead in the paints. And the lead found out to be in the paints, especially when little children or pets were scratching at paints and the trim of houses that were built in 1910. That lead poisoning resulted in damaging these little children. And it affects them. It can affect them severely, it can affect them lightly, but it also poses a risk to pregnant women. The seller of any interest in residential property is required to provide the buyer with any information on lead-based paint hazards from risk assessments. There's also a small pamphlet about lead-based paints, and you must provide that to the buyer as well. So it says a risk assessment or inspection for possible lead-based paint hazards is recommended, especially if somebody's going to do a lot of remodeling and they start just scraping paint off these old trims around windows and doorways, and they hadn't been made aware of lead paint and the lead paint poisoning. They are submitting themselves and the air in that house with lead. And when that lead is taken in, it can get absorbed into the blood and be very dangerous. So lead-based paint addendum S is important. So it's put the address in here on line 10, and then seller disclosure and certification. Seller discloses. Seller hereby represents that seller has no knowledge of any lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards, LBP, present in the property, except, and if they do have knowledge, they have to talk about, this room was being painted and the painter had to do wet sanding because they were told it's lead paint. Something like that. But basically, most sellers have no knowledge, and this is actual knowledge, of any lead-based paint. Now you can assume it with a lot of these older houses because that was the preferred good paint that was used. But unless you have any knowledge, basically what you put on that line is none. Seller has no knowledge, none. Explain the information to the seller, including additional information. If LBP exists on the property, the location, or what room, what area, and the condition of the painted surfaces. If it's peeling, if it's covered by wallpaper, or indicate none. Number B, seller confirms that seller has provided the buyer with the following records and reports which comprise all of the reports and records available to the seller pertaining to lead-based paint or paint hazards. And on this line, you would put none available. Unless, if they have none. If they do, they are to disclose them and provide that. So the undersigned seller has reviewed the information above, certifies to the best of their knowledge that the information provided them is true and accurate. And this is where all seller signatures go on this line, and they're printed and the date. So this breaks down now what the results, if they do have any information, what that could be. You have to provide that little pamphlet to the buyer. You have to disclose of any known LPB to the buyer. Disclosure of known records to the agent, provision of available LBP records or reports, and disclosure prior to acceptance of the offer. These are the requirements for the seller. And when you are the listing agent, you are actually required to go over these 4 provisions and disclosures with the seller. And this is certification and acknowledgement of LBP disclosure. Each contract to sell target housing shall include an attachment or addendum containing the following elements. And these are the following elements: definitions. Definitions available means the possession or reasonably obtainable by the seller at the time of disclosure. Any reports available. Any abatement done means the permanent elimination of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. Inspection, buyer means who the purchaser is. Inspection means a surface by surface investigation to determine the presence of lead-based paint. Lead-based paint means paint or other surface coatings that contain lead equal to or in excess of 1 milligram per square centimeter. Lead-based paint hazard. Reduction means designed to reduce or eliminate human exposure. Risk assessment means are you talking? Target housing, any house constructed prior to 1978. And then there's a place for the 2 agents, listing agents and buyer's agent, to sign. Buyer's agent, opportunity to conduct an evaluation. So if they want to have this as a contingency in their offer, they're to check 1 box on lines 131, 131, 147, and 148. So to check this box, if the buyer elects the LBP contingency, buyer has attached to this addendum S, or buyer waives the opportunity for an LBP inspection or assessment. Make sure that your buyer checks one of these, checks this, and one of these. They either want that contingency in the offer or they are waiving. Must give them the pamphlet. Buyer acknowledges and certifies that the buyer has received the seller's above indicated disclosures, reports, records, and has the pamphlet. And then when the buyer can read that acknowledgement and certify it, then the buyer's signed here, both buyers. And that's the addendum S. People normally just quickly fill it in. Most people waive the opportunity for an LBP inspection or assessment because it can be quite involved. But if you ever have any questions about it, any property that you're a little concerned about, please give Steph or me a call because it's a very, very important addendum to your offers for older homes. So that's pretty much it. Any questions? This is just an awareness topic. but it's very important, two addendums that are extremely important to your business and to your clients. But other than that, say farewell. And we'll continue. There is no contract training next week because it's Memorial Day. So we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you both, Dennis and Maggie, for participating.
Thank you, Joan. It's a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.